Welcome to the 1 hour or so virtual ambulatory pediatric fellowship. My name is Bruce Bedingfield. I've been a pediatrician for a little over 40 years. I retired this past October 2020, having started a solo general pediatric practice in September 1981. When I retired, our practice had 6 physicians and 3 pediatric nurse practitioners. I had initially intended to retire in September of 2021, thus reaching even 40 years of practice. But the year that was 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic inspired me to retire a little bit earlier at the age of 71. I am also Dr. Amanda Rogers' father. And Dr. Rogers has told me that through the years, many of her pediatrics residents have expressed some apprehension about leaving the comfortable hospital environment and stepping into private practice. That might be especially true for third-year residents, already with a practice, but aware of just how much of a change that's going to be. Dr. Rogers, as a hospitalist, realizes that she may not feel comfortable teaching you how to bridge that gap. She is aware, however, that I experienced many of the same apprehensions and fears that you probably are going through right now. As a doctor of osteopathic medicine in the late 1970s, in fact, our pediatric residency was only 2 years following a classic 1-year rotating internship. I certainly yearned to get more training before undertaking a private pediatric practice. Fortunately for me, there was something in the 1970s and 1980s called an ambulatory pediatric fellowship. They could be 1 year or 2 years if you wanted to become certified. I had no reason to become certified. I simply wanted more preparation. I was able to secure a fellowship at the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh from July 1980 until July 1981. Ambulatory pediatric fellowships no longer exist. That is not an option that you're going to have. So Dr. Rogers and I thought that I could sit down and offer you a brief virtual ambulatory pediatric fellowship based on my 40 years of office-based pediatric practice. We hope you find it helpful. So what did my ambulatory pediatric fellowship look like? I chose Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh for its strength in otolaryngology. At that time, anyway, it was probably the leading center for pediatric ENT in the country. I especially wanted more expertise in approaching otitis media. That was before the pneumococcal vaccines were routinely given, so ear infections were even more pertinent, more prevalent than they currently are. Plus, all cases were treated long before any watch and wait approach. And diagnosing subtle ear infections is not always easy. The head of our ambulatory pediatric fellowship was Dr. Jack Paradise, a general academic pediatrician who was among the country's leading experts in otitis media. Dr. Paradise had previously been in private practice for a number of years, yet had long done research on otitis, even in those early years. Dr. Paradise certainly taught me the importance of and the technique to perform pneumatic otoscopy, a skill that I certainly encourage for you. In fact, he had developed the Paradise otoscope, perfected to be airtight. Pittsburgh Children's also had Dr. Charles Bluestone, again, probably the most prominent pediatric otolaryngologist at that time. Dr. Paradise made sure that I spent time with Dr. Bluestone, especially when he was inserting tympanostomy tubes. I would examine ears before the procedure and make a note as to what I thought was there. Then I would watch a surgery to see what they did in fact find. It was a different time. Dr. Bluestone also did landmark research on the need for tonsillectomies, concluding appropriate candidates should have at least 3 documented episodes of tonsillitis a year for 3 consecutive years, 5 a year for 2 years, or 7 in 1 year. Before Dr. Bluestone's study, tonsillectomy was often a rite of passage for children, certainly for me and my age group. Also at that time, the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh had the infectious disease specialist, Dr. Ellen Wald, who has now long been chair of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine in Madison. This was the beginning of Dr. Wald's impressive research on sinus infections in children. Before that, pediatric sinus infections really weren't recognized much. Obviously, expertise in ear, nose, and throat issues in children continues to be very important for the general pediatrician. Another benefit of my fellowship was that my chief, Dr. Paradise, had trained under the famous pediatrician and parenting author, Benjamin Spock, at the Mayo Clinic. So Dr. Benjamin Spock was my mentor's mentor. Through Dr. Spock's writing, I was able to learn the importance of writing both pediatric and parenting information for parents. In fact, Dr. Paradise had a collection of Spock's well-child information sheets from the 1940s that inspired me to write similar sheets for both that children's hospital and eventually for my own practice. I was flattered that they continued to use them after I left. One other benefit of my ambulatory pediatric fellowship was exposure there to pediatric subspecialists in the ambulatory setting. I mentioned my exposure to the ENT surgeon, Dr. Bluestone, yet I also spent a considerable amount of time with pediatric dermatologists and pediatric allergists. Plus, we often overlapped our training with the Department of Behavioral Pediatrician Fellows, getting an extra degree of exposure at that realm as well. I should mention mine was actually called an ambulatory and community pediatric fellowship. I was able to work at and temporarily supervise a neighborhood health clinic. I also served as consultant for that neighborhood's daycare and for the suburban Pittsburgh elementary school. Again, I could have trained there for 2 years, perhaps then going somewhere into an academic position. But after that year, I felt better about going back home to Chicago and join a pediatric practice. Eventually, I chose the scarier route of starting my own. Although I decided not to formally teach, I quickly realized we teach all the time in private practice, residents and medical students perhaps, but we constantly teach parents and our patients as well. So what can your ambulatory pediatric fellowship look like? My intention in presenting all this information is to share from my 40-year experience in ambulatory pediatrics. I will begin that soon. Yet when you begin your career, you can and you should pick the brain of your new associates, your colleagues. Perhaps you will have a senior pediatrician with as much, even though more experience than I. Collectively, your colleagues will probably have much more. As I speak of your colleagues, I am assuming, of course, you will be joining an existing practice, not starting one yourself. Starting a solo practice was not all that common in 1981, and it certainly isn't the norm today. Let me say, if that is your intention, I would be happy to discuss it with you on a one-to-one basis. Solo practice was an extremely challenging lifestyle, and I quickly realized it wasn't for me. I pursued a partner after 5 years in practice and filled the position after 6. Assuming you will be going into practice with others, I certainly hope you have opportunities to talk with each other on a regular basis. Our practice quickly began the routine of discussing our clinical approaches every Tuesday at lunchtime. Those sessions were especially helpful when one of us would go away for a CME conference. Yet it's always important to discuss each other's clinical approach to various situations. You can't and you won't establish perfectly unified approach, but then it's important to be fully aware of how you differ. Provided your colleagues are willing, I strongly recommend you not hesitate to bring them into the exam room if you're not sure of what you're seeing, especially a mysterious rash. I was very impressed once reading about current care at the Mayo Clinic. Despite the obvious expertise of their individual clinicians, they all feel free to bring in a colleague to get their input on a case. If they find that important at the Mayo Clinic, I figured it was all the more important at my practice. So I'm not just addressing your early weeks or months, but every decade of your practice. It works both ways, please remember. For you have much to teach your seasoned colleagues. You will have just completed your residency at a prestigious children's hospital. Your knowledge is hot off the press. Plus, I can attest your increased comfort level with online information and state-of-the-art technology will help empower and probably intimidate your senior associates. Now, what can I teach you that may be of benefit? So that's a bit about my ambulatory pediatric fellowship, what mine looked like, and perhaps what you can arrange to do instead. The main thing I want to do now is to share some things that I've learned over 40 years of office practice. Not everything, of course, hopefully. I've learned more, hopefully I've learned more in those 40 years, each month, each day. Yet what can I teach you from those years of practice? Please indulge me as I try to share some advice. Some of these things you may already know, of course. Others you may not care to know. If they are new ideas and you think they may prove helpful, you're welcome to use them. Still more important, if they help your patients, that will be well worth the effort. And if more than one person watches or reads this, not only you, but others also benefit, then that would be wonderful. I have chosen to divide this into chapters. I've already decided the topics I wanted to cover are the following: selling yourself, communication tips, making use of your time, philosophical thoughts, helpful resources, a few things I've already contributed to the literature, and miscellaneous advice. Selling yourself to new or potential patients and families. I suppose it may seem a little crass to begin by talking about selling yourself. You are anxious, after all, to help people, to take care of children. Yet, of course, you have to attract patients to take care of in the first place. That was certainly the case as I started a new practice from scratch. And in fact, we never knew whether to consider September 15th or September 16th, 1981, as the first day of the practice. Indeed, we opened our doors on the 15th, but no one came. Late in the day of September 16th, our first patient called for an appointment and came in. Actually, I was fortunate in that the head of the busiest OB group in town had married one of my favorite people. I got referrals quickly, but referrals mean nothing if those families are not pleased with your care. You are most likely joining an existing practice with plenty of patients. Yet you then need to win the heart of those families. As new providers joined our practice, we had the policy of any patient of ours is a patient of yours. You, however, may be expected to attract and build your own clientele. Even if you can see those existing patients, you want to earn their respect and their acceptance. My wife, Gail, eventually joined our practice as a pediatric nurse practitioner. I mentioned how we opened the practice. However, she was the other half of we. Gail was my nurse and receptionist in the very early weeks. You can logically accept and correctly assume she is also Dr. Rogers' mother. Gail recently suggested I share with you the thought of having to sell yourself. As a hospital nurse, she was simply assigned to patients and they to her. As a resident, that applies to you as well. For her as a nurse practitioner, and for you as a new physician, however, you build a reputation from day one. And in the 21st century, you will be a brand new topic on social media. I want to offer 3 suggestions to help you build your reputation. The first is a concept that you've heard through most all of your life, yet it's so very important to bear in mind. That's the golden rule. Despite what we may think early on, the golden rule, the idea of treating others the way we would want to be treated, belongs to no one religion or culture. It's more of a universal truth. Keep it in mind, please, from the very first day of practice to your last. As I'll talk about more later, I tend to be big on philosophy. But this was the one and only philosophy I spoke of early in my practice, and I continue to throughout. For a number of years, I would only hire mothers so that they could always identify with our patients' parents. Plus, I am completely confident each of you were a child yourself at one time. A child apprehensive about going to the doctor. Always treat those patients the way you would want to be treated. A second piece of advice to win the hearts of your patient families is to check on how they're doing after a sick visit. Quite honestly, that's something I did regularly only in the second half of my 40-year career. Before that, I would do the best I could, then move on to the next patient. Most got better, of course, but some didn't. I then read something very true, that patients and in pediatrics families like to know you are thinking of them and caring about them, even when you are not in the midst of an encounter. Eventually, it clicked in my mind that checking in after a sick visit would convince them that I cared, which of course I did. It takes some time, and you certainly can't do it all for every sick visit, but I quickly got a feeling for which patient problems to check in and how long to give before they should be getting better. Years ago, I would give our receptionist a list each day, and they would bring me the charts. More recently, I could set up a tickler file on our Epic system on who I wanted to call and on which day. Let me say, I believe it was one of the most important habits I developed in my career. Families, for the most part, were indeed extremely appreciative that I was interested. Not surprisingly, it also is an excellent method of continuing medical education. We think of evidence-based medicine as being those medical treatments certified, verified as effective by a critical mass of data. Yet there is something very instructive in finding out whether what you said and did really was helpful. It's certainly easy to hope and assume that no news is good news. But if you take no other piece of advice from me, allow me to encourage you to take this one. Over the course of your career, unfortunately, some patients won't get better. Some will die. Not many, I hope, but some will. Once again, show the family you care. If there's a visitation, go there. Attend the funeral if you can. If you've ever lost a loved one, you know how much just showing up can mean. In this case, you're not trying to win their hearts. You simply realize that their hearts will forever be broken. The third strategy to help sell yourself is to maintain contact with your families when their children are patients in the hospital. You will always practice now in the era of hospitalists. Yet that specialty emerged just about halfway through my career. Hospital care of our patients was a major portion of our practice before that. It's somewhat ironic, you may notice, that I made a point of specializing in ambulatory pediatrics. Then my daughter chose to become a hospitalist. Due to her decision, and because the concept just makes sense, I've been a big believer in the role of hospitalists from the beginning. When your patients are hospitalized, however, I strongly recommend you check in on them each day. Early on, our hospital, we were able to pick and choose which patients we would care for and which ones we would ask the hospitalist to. We would then do courtesy rounds on those that the hospitalist cared for. And up to the COVID-19 crisis, we were able to continue doing that. I know, and perhaps from here on out, they shouldn't. But that doesn't mean that you can't call the hospitalist or primary care nurse to check on them and call the family as well. It takes time and it's not reimbursed, but I strongly encourage you to do it. You most likely won't be able to make clinical decisions, and I suppose your advice may not always be welcome. Yet your insights into the family and their concerns and worries will be priceless. My point, however, is that the family will very much appreciate it. Now, there are pediatricians who choose not to see their own well baby in the hospital. I personally consider that to be self-abuse. I suppose there are practices that choose not to as well. If you have a choice in the matter, however, I strongly urge you to care for your own newborns. That also establishes an important bond. So often the parent would point to me over the years and say, "This is the first doctor who ever examined you." 3 of the very best moments of life are holding your own newborn child, holding your newborn patient, and holding your own newborn grandchild. Now, you're just going to have to wait and see which one of those 3 you think is the best. There are other things to be done, of course, to build a reputation. Speaking to community groups is always appreciated. Blogs and Facebook entries make good sense today. Make it a point of clarifying what name the patient prefers to go by, and always use your computer sticky notes to clarify exactly how to pronounce everyone's name. We're speaking of your reputation, something to develop and maintain from your first day of practice to your very last. Communication. The next thing I want to discuss is communication. We communicate with parents, with patients, and with their parents continually. Doing it well is in itself a way to build a good reputation. Communication is simply an essential skill. As I say that, I feel compelled to admit I'm not a very good communicator. You probably have noticed by now, I'm a guy. Women, I believe, often inherently possess better communication skills than men. And among men, most probably communicate better than I do. Yet over 40 years of practice, probably every other physician, have chosen certain points and certain methods I feel are important to communicate. Some of these are spiels I've developed over the years. Others are a few simple principles I feel important to share with you. Ironically, the first spiel I want to share is one I began just in the very last years of my practice. For each sick visit, after taking the history and doing this exam, I would say, allow me to gather and jot down some thoughts before I talk too much. Obviously, if the problem was trivial or mild, I quickly reassured them not to be worried while I gave myself these moments. Yet I had learned long before not to think out loud as I gathered information. I believe our opinion has more impact if we're not too quick to spill it out. Quite frankly, this method does get their attention and interest. Again, however, I convey very early on, if appropriate, not to be worried awaiting my thoughts. The next two spiels come at the end of every visit, one for sick visits and one for well. It was influenced by my reading an excellent book about 20 years ago, Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Coleman. Coleman reported on a study of patients and physicians' waiting rooms. Each had a list of questions for the doctor that they were about to see. Yet when they left after the visit, half their questions had not been answered. I quickly realized that answering all those questions as best I could was among the very most important tasks I had. Shortly thereafter, I developed my AAA question for each well visit. At the very end, I would ask, does that answer and address and accomplish everything you had in mind today? In the vast majority, it had, or would within moments if they still expressed concerns. Sometimes, of course, it opened into a topic I might not have time to adequately address. When that occurred, we would have to arrange a follow-up to give the topic justice. It didn't fully answer it all, nor did it accomplish it yet, but it had been heard and addressed. So that was my well visits. For sick visits, I always knew I never cured anything in the course of the visit. I suppose if I removed a splinter. Eventually then, I began to end every sick visit by saying, now that doesn't cure anything, but does that at least answer all your questions and address all your concerns? After a while, of course, you learn to anticipate certain questions that they may have unspoken. After seeing a patient for an illness, you appropriately treat with antibiotics or another definitive treatment. They want to ask, what would have happened if we hadn't come in? Often then, I myself would pose the question, acknowledging it frequently is on parents' minds. In that case, sometimes the answer was she would have gotten sicker and sicker, so you would have known you had to come in. Other times, I gave reassurance that the body is capable of fighting the infection off, but then an antibiotic will end the illness quicker. One classic spoken or unspoken question and fear regards the potential dangers of fevers. I suppose every pediatrician has to eventually develop their own spiel for that one. In a similar vein, there were times I would feel confident that a clinical situation would turn out harmless and benign, yet sensed it would be wise to run tests in order to comfort the parent. I will admit, appropriately or not, I was more conservative than most in running tests. When I did, I had another spiel offering them the best of both worlds. The reassurance, I sincerely didn't think it was the reassurance that I simply didn't think it was serious, yet that I would try to prove it for their peace of mind and for mine. I would often also say that for borderline decisions on consultations as well. I enjoyed going through another spiel with my patients themselves as they got older. It was especially appropriate for teens, and it carried more weight the less I repeated it. I would say, the older you get, the less my job is to tell your parents how to take care of you, and the more my job is teaching you how to take good care of yourself. With that, I would go on to give a brief lecture on nutrition or sleep habits or physical fitness or whatever. For I firmly believe one of our very most important jobs as pediatricians is to teach our patients health habits that can last a lifetime. Remember, in fact, they may have a momentary recollection of you conveying that lesson to anytime the situation comes up in the rest of their life. There are two specific situations I want to also address that require our communication skills. One is that extraordinarily sensitive subject of obesity. It's often one of the most uncomfortable topics we ever discuss, yet it's such an incredibly important condition with lifelong ramifications. For who could be a more appropriate person to address it than the pediatrician? Yet we are exceptionally aware we are affecting their ongoing self-image and opening the dangers of overreaction. I can't address it properly now. You want to carefully formulate your own approach. In the context of my spiels, however, I tried to frame it within the realm of simply bad luck. I pointed out what they already knew. They have peers, perhaps even siblings, who eat more than they do and exercise less, yet they are skinny as a beanpole. It's not fair, but often our overweight patients are forced to eat healthier and exercise more in order to achieve the weight that they want. For boys in particular, I would point out that they were big and perhaps always will be. Yet they want to be big and strong throughout their life by eating healthy and always staying in shape. Again, however, tread carefully on this sensitive and very important topic. The other topic is a lighter one, yet holds great importance to the parent. toilet training. Let me say, unless, as before, I would bring it up at 18 months and describe it as a journey from then until 3 years old. Yet it's often a journey with 3 steps forward and then 2 backward. When the child was interested in making progress, I encouraged the parents to praise them and let them know how proud they were. Then, when the child lost interest or fought them on it for a while, to just back off. There were some children, of course, who still weren't trained at the 3rd birthday or beyond. Eventually, especially if the parents were very concerned, I would recommend an important meeting. I encourage both parents and the child to go to a favorite restaurant, just the 3 of them. At the meeting, the parents conveyed they had something very important to talk about. They shared it was time to give up diapers, for that's what 3-year-olds or 3.5-year-olds or 4-year-olds do. They would also convey that they have every confidence that the child could do it. So those were some of my usual spiels, but I want to make 3 general points about communication. The first has to do with eye contact. I started the section by admitting I'm not very good at communication, but you'll find this is my longest section because communication is so very important. Well, within the topic of communication, eye contact can often be important. Yet I must admit, I'm not very good at that either. I had to teach myself early on to clarify parents' eye color when first meeting them, and thus force myself to make that eye contact. As you may already realize, children, on the other hand, often don't feel comfortable with eye contact. That's something you have to get a feel for. Yet about a decade ago, it was a specialist I saw, me being the patient, who taught me an important lesson on eye contact. At the time, we didn't have electronic medical records yet, but he did. During the encounter, I would say he had eye contact with his computer over 95% of the time, and eye contact with me less than 5%. When we got our EPIC system in 2014, I realized he had taught me what not to do. I'm sure he is more efficient in his daily charting than I am. Suddenly, in September 2014, my charting time increased considerably. Yet I maintained a determination to look at the parent as I wrote sketchy notes to be typed out later. You, I know, are natives to computerized charting and can formulate your own best approach. My third general comment about communication is to always remember we communicate through our example. I think back to my parents' internist as I was growing up. That was at a time he would advise them to quit smoking, as he was smoking in front of them. He was a little overweight, yet no doubt would often give advice on nutrition. Let me quickly say, however, he was a hero for me growing up and influenced me more than anyone else to go into medicine. By the time he accepted me as a patient during my teen years, he had transitioned to smoking a pipe. Between that and the fact that my girlfriend at the time thought pipe smoking was cool, I naturally gave it a try. I don't advise it to any of you unless you enjoy the idea of setting your tongue on fire. Communication by example takes on special importance if you live in the same community and you practice it. If you go bike riding and your patients might see you, it's essential to wear a bike helmet. I didn't eat very nutritionally early on in my career, so I would dread seeing patients at the grocery store. I had to hide my Doritos and my Frosted Flakes. Eventually, I gave them up. I was honored that many of our neighbors entrusted their children to my care. Yet I also enjoyed smoking a cigar on my front porch all of about 6 times a year. At first, I had to acknowledge that as I counseled neighborhood children against ever smoking. Eventually, I chose to forgo those 6 annual cigars as well. Use of your time. So that's what I wanted to share on communication, and that was a lot. The next topic I want to discuss is one's use of time. And along that theme, I think I'll pick things up a bit. First, I'll talk briefly on the importance of habit, especially good habits. I don't make it a regular practice to read Aristotle, but I did once read a book called Aristotle for Everyone. Aristotle taught that if one habitually does the same thing about the same general time most every day, they end up being more efficient, for they don't have to waste time deciding what to do next. I found that quite helpful during my career. Incidentally, it seems to be pretty helpful in retirement as well. I spoke earlier about the effect of electronic charting on my efficiency. It was a disaster. Then, in those earliest days of that transition, I fell far behind in a lot of my daily tasks, paperwork, correspondence, and so on. As I struggled to get caught up, I remembered a principle I had learned early on as it related to keeping current on medical literature. Keeping up is much easier than catching up. And as an aside, no doubt you've noticed the same thing is true for physical fitness. Soon I would start my daily to-do list with catch up, keep up. Then I added follow-up. Follow-up on those sick visits, for following up on those sick visits remained important. My decrease in efficiency caused a natural decrease in my productivity. Yet as I looked at my schedule, I found spots I could open up to fit in patients who needed, or at least wanted, to come in. So I added open up. Finally, I determined to maintain the habit of trying to learn at least one new thing each day, to step up. Thus, each day I began my to-do list: catch up, keep up, follow up, open up, and step up. Third, regarding use of time, are some thoughts on the things that we try to accomplish within a set period of time during well-child care. Pediatricians currently make use of Bright Futures 4 guidelines. I was honored to serve on the Bright Futures 3 Users Committee. I also served on their Anticipatory Guidance Subcommittee. We struggled there on how to fit in all the things that need to be addressed within a reasonable period of time. Eventually, I expressed the importance of accomplishing 5 simultaneous goals. Number 1, spend enough time to meet the family's needs. 2, stay on time so as not to keep subsequent families waiting. 3, see enough patients so we can be available to those who need to be seen. 4, see enough patients as to make an adequate profit. And 5, do it all in a relaxed and unhurried manner. I can't say in my 40 years I always accomplish it, but it remains a worthy goal to strive for. A little bit of philosophy. I want to talk a little bit on philosophy. I would flatter myself if I implied it was wisdom. I can't claim to be wise, but I have proof that I am philosophical. Many years ago, my church ran a spiritual gift survey called Gift Quest. It included a section on job aptitude. I was pleased that it showed I was on the 94th percentile of the population for becoming a physician. But I was amused then, and I still am. It showed I was on the 99.3 percentile for becoming a philosopher. There have been a number of wise physicians, however. I would hope you've become quite familiar with the 19th century internist, Sir William Osler. His clinical medical writing was wonderful, although it was naturally long out of date. Yet his philosophical writings for medical students, residents, and other physicians remain timeless. They are well worth your attention. Perhaps you've seen this piece of his writing in Dr. Rogers' office. The practice of medicine will be very much as you make it. To one, a worry, a care, a perpetual annoyance. To another, a daily job and a life of as much happiness and usefulness as can well fall to the lot of man. I used to give it to our third year medical students finishing a pediatric rotation in our office. I recommend you always recall that this is a choice that we make every day. I also recommend that you always remember to enjoy our daily encounters with children, perhaps most of all with babies. That lesson was brought home to me one day when I was walking down Front Street in Lahaina, Hawaii. I was fortunate to have a sister with a condominium in Maui. If you've never been there, I strongly recommend it, especially if you can convince a sibling to buy a condo there. It's truly paradise. One very pleasant day, I was walking in that paradise, able to glance over and see the ocean. All the faces that we passed, however, had serious adult expressions. We probably did as well. Yet when those tourists looked down and saw my 4-month-old great nephew in a stroller, their faces broke into a big smile. From then on, I tried to never forget our wonderful privilege enjoying babies every day. Another philosophical thought is a very humbling concept for us to be aware of, one I'm sure you've heard somewhere along the way. That is the fact that 50% of what we learn in medical school, and presumably in residency training, will eventually turn out to be wrong. And of course, we can't reasonably know which 50% it will be, but it's certainly important to bear in mind. One last philosophical thought I want to make is the importance of teaching. Like you, I taught in my residency. Perhaps like you, I was so influenced by my role models in medical school, residency, and fellowship that I naturally assumed I would become a teacher as well. As it turned out, I didn't teach medical students in the office until the middle third of my career. That may also have been influenced by Osler, as he encouraged physicians in their 40s to teach medical students in their 20s. And as you have no doubt come to realize, teaching is a wonderful way to learn. Always remember that principle I just mentioned, though, that perhaps 50% of what you teach will be wrong. So include some philosophy as well. Finally, if you never teach fellow physicians, we must continually teach our patients and their parents. Resources available to you. I want you to remember you have many resources available to you. One, of course, is the American Academy of Pediatrics. You also have your state's chapter of the AAP. Your local chapter would love to have you as a resource, although I haven't gotten involved until my retirement. Another resource is very much a part of your life now, your local children's hospital. You know you have trained at a very high-quality children's hospital. Always remember that's one of your professional strengths. If you stay in the Milwaukee area, that will be your resource, a wonderful one. Wherever you settle, however, I encourage you to affiliate with the closest children's hospital. Having trained at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, I had connections to win acceptance to Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago from 1982 until I retired 38 years later, when it was called Lurie Children's Hospital. Still, another resource for you is the World Wide Web and all the other digital resources. You are much more familiar with those online technologies than I am. I will simply point out how lucky you are to have it all. You've had it from the beginning of your schooling, and it will only improve from here. Don't hesitate to make use of the classic pediatric textbooks, however. Probably the best, as you're well aware, is Nelson's textbook of pediatrics. You nailed that well at the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, as you are blessed to have Dr. Robert Kliegman, who I understand likes to be referred to there as Bob. His name is one that I've watched rise to the top on the edge of my various editions of Nelson's throughout my career. Before I close this chapter, I want you to be fully aware of my professional hero throughout my career, Dr. T. Barry Brazelton. As my internist influenced me the most to enter medicine, it was Dr. Brazelton's writings that influenced me the most to enter pediatrics. He trained and practiced at Boston Children's and at Harvard Medical School. He was one of the very first developmental and behavioral pediatricians. But he had practiced general office-based pediatrics for a number of years. Brazelton wrote a wonderful array of books for parents. He wrote for professionals, of course, but parents were his focus. If I were to recommend just one of his books, it would be Touchpoints. Yet any book Brazelton wrote for parents would be well worth your time. Let me go on to recommend you read lots of other books for parents as well. There are certainly a great number to choose from. Don't hesitate to ask your colleagues what they have found helpful. Your patient's parents will recommend books for you to read. Go ahead and read them if you're so inclined, then decide whether you want to recommend them to others. In the course of my career, the AAP went from just publishing some brochures to becoming perhaps the primary publisher of parenting books, most of which are very good. Pediatric Care Online has also emerged as an excellent resource for parents, and thus for pediatricians as well. Reading material for parents can help you in three ways. First, you will no doubt gain knowledge you did not previously have. Second, you will find material you want to share with your families and perhaps your older patients as well. Of course, you may also find references you want to steer them away from. Finally, you will get insight on how to teach parents and patients, along with the feel for the most appropriate teaching level. The last resource for you is to do with management, practice management. Please allow me to say I'm betting that that won't necessarily be of much interest to you now. Perhaps it never will. In a different era, however, you might have gotten quickly involved in it, even maybe opened a brand new practice. Perhaps you are, or perhaps you have an opportunity to get involved in pediatric management early on. If so, the Academy of Pediatrics can be of great help. I also want to make you aware of the Pediatric Management Institute, headquartered in Texas. If you are indeed opening a new practice, I would invite you to contact me. I would be glad to talk to you on a personal basis. some things I've already shared. There are some things you might say that I've added to the pediatric literature. Contemporary Pediatrics emerged as a new practical journal early in my career, and I found it helpful throughout that career. At one time, they had a feature called Clinical Tip, in which readers could offer helpful tips to each other. In July 2001, I had one published called The Secret to Health and Wealth. It all came from another one of my many spiels. Illinois used to mandate a school physical for 10-year-olds before 5th grade. Later, with changes in the immunization schedule, it was switched to entering 6th grade. In either case, I would tell the patient I had a secret for them on how to stay healthy and wealthy throughout their life. Don't let me forget to tell you. That would effectively pique their interest, although I admit not as much as it got their parents' interest. Toward the very end, I would say, oh, that secret I mentioned, never ever start smoking cigarettes. You'll always be healthier, and think about all the money you can save over a lifetime by not spending it on cigarettes. I do believe it did some good. Very, very few of my patients smoked, although I must admit, I don't know how wealthy they are. Then in September 2017, Contemporary Pediatrics published my tip that they titled Farm Stand Pediatrics. At that time, our office was across the street from a farm stand selling fresh fruits and vegetables. During the summer, we would give out prescriptions for nutrition. Children could present it and obtain a free piece of fruit. It made that fruit special, and of course, the family stayed to explore and buy plenty more fresh fruits and vegetables. When I first proposed the idea to the farm stand, they wanted me to pay for the free piece of fruit. I assured them that no one would be picking up their fruit without paying more. I continued to do that through the last 30 years of my practice, and I never heard that request again. My experience with Bright Futures gave me some credence among those writing on well child care. I was honored in October 2006 to have Pediatrics publish a commentary I wrote called Pediatric Health Maintenance in the 21st Century, A View from the Trenches. Again, as part of the Bright Futures Anticipatory Guidance Subcommittee, and at that time having 25 years of experience, I was a voice reminding the others that we have to be selective in what we teach, as we only have so much time. I can best summarize that article by listing its various sections. Remember, we are teachers more than healers. Keep in mind, however, less is often more. Do not hesitate to structure the visit. One size does not necessarily fit all. Let's emphasize the medical home, not the solo provider. Let's not wait for evidence. Let's create it. Ending with, remember the most important question. You already know that question was, does that answer all your questions and accomplish everything you wanted to today? Although I hadn't quite refined my AAA question yet at that time. Another piece I had published on well child care appeared in the April 2008 issue of Pediatric Annals. Actually, I was one of 11 contributors to that article, titled Choosing the Bright Futures Guidelines, Lessons from Leaders and Early Adopters. I was certainly not a leader, but I truly was an early adopter. I was honored that Dr. Gregory Plushke, indeed a leader, remembered me from our Bright Futures work together and asked me to participate. My section I titled Bright Futures Indeed. This dealt with using Bright Futures when the third edition was new. It caused me to recall the very early roots of Bright Futures, as I well remembered an article in the November 1986 issue of Pediatrics in Review, written by a renowned developmental and behavioral pediatrician, Dr. Morris Green. That 9-page article, probably the most influential article upon my career, evolved into Bright Futures by 1994. I was amused and I guess a little disturbed. The Pediatric Annals asked me to write as a pediatrician in the later stages of practice. In 2020, I accepted that easily, but this was only 2008. Yet I did stress in that article the importance of pediatricians of any age trying to enhance and improve their health maintenance a bit more throughout their career. I'd like to think I continued to do that throughout my subsequent years as well. Again, being a philosopher, I included one of my favorite quotations, this one from Sidney J. Harris. The race indeed is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, but triumph comes to those who every day and every year get better at what they do. Perhaps my favorite contribution to what's been written appeared in the January 2006 Medical Economics. New year, new plan. It was inspired by a thought I had on the previous year's New Year's Day. I decided that during every patient encounter that year, I would teach one thing and pay one compliment. You've heard me enough already to see I wasn't talking about teaching 17 things, but at least one. Then in the course of the visit, I would pay at least one compliment, perhaps to the child, perhaps to the parent, as they strive to parent. By the end of that New Year's Day, I had added, share one laugh. Eventually, of course, I realized laughter might not be appropriate in every encounter. Yet even then, every visit needed a smile. By the time I wrote the article, I also realized that we as providers deserve those three considerations as well. As I've said, I wanted to teach myself at least one thing each day. Often it would be a topic that came up that I wanted to review. Too often it might be something I did that I wanted to confirm I had done appropriately. Occasionally that meant I would call the family back, apologize, and change things a bit. Yet I also wanted to pay myself one compliment, something I did well and could take some satisfaction in. Finally, I tried to take one thing from the day to laugh about. And the best days were the ones I could bring that laughter back home to share with my family. If you read just one piece that I've mentioned, let me recommend this one from Medical Economics, January 2006. I would be honored if you found it helpful. Only a few points on patient care. The points I'm going to make on general pediatric care will be very limited. I encourage you to pick the brain of your future colleagues as to how they recommend that you handle various clinical situations. Yet again, as you try these suggestions, I recommend you follow up with your patients to ensure it all worked. You and I must both remember maybe 50% of what I say will turn out to be wrong. Because I did follow up in the way, however, I'd like to think that my percentages will be a little bit better. I mentioned the emphasis on otolaryngology in my ambulatory pediatric fellowship. So let me start with that topic. Remember, I strongly recommend that you become skilled in pneumatic otoscopy. Tympanograms and other technology are fine, but do get a clear view of the eardrum and check both its position and movement. Be sure to follow up with an ear check in 2 to 4 weeks, at least for children less than 5 who can't clearly report how they're feeling. I'm a purist on pharyngitis. Do a strep test. Treat it if it's positive, and don't treat it if it's not. If it's not, however, you or someone else should be sure that they're getting better. Remember, sinus infections also cause sore throats, so watch for those. With sinus infections, we're usually talking about a cold that lasts 2 or more weeks and isn't getting better. I also suggest you treat a sinus infection at least 2 weeks or it won't stay better. Dr. Wald would advise treating a sinus infection at least a week after the patient is all better. I found that helpful. But again, it means you follow up, if only by phone. Plus, please be aware, most young children don't really know what a sore throat means. So don't ask if they have one, and certainly don't ask their parents. Kids soon know what it means to swallow, however. If they do, point to your own throat and ask if it hurts every time that they swallow. Now let me transition to some practical points on gastroenterology. Please remember that constipation happens, and in kids, it happens a lot. I might add, just because a parent says, but she's having a bowel movement every day, doesn't mean that she's not constipated. It's an extremely common reason for abdominal pain, and yet it can also cause painless enteroparesis or obstipation. Unfortunately, rectal exams are extremely unpleasant and thus often best avoided. Too often, constipation can't be detected just by feeling the abdomen. Not everyone will approve of my saying this, but sometimes a KUB plays a role in confirming the diagnosis. Fortunately, we now have Miralax available, polyethylene glycol. Use it freely, but be sure you're using it for constipation. I want to say lactose intolerance happens a lot as well, much more in some races than others. Yet our country is such a melting pot. We see it a great deal, often causing abdominal pain, gas, and diarrhea. Fortunately, again, we live in an era with easy access to lactose-free milk and other lactose-free dairy products. I purposely specify dairy as I stress lactose-free cow's milk. I certainly encourage milk, but I'd like to state that almonds and other nuts are not mammals. Let me use that then as a segue into nutrition. I do encourage milk. Skim if they're overweight and 2% if they're not. If they have a tendency to avoid it, consider lactose-free. I encourage them to drink 2 to 3 glasses a day as one of those health habits I mentioned earlier. Regarding nutrition, my wife Gail has her own spiel. Holding up her hand, she would recommend 5 servings of fruit or vegetables a day, 4 glasses of water, 3 sources of calcium, 2 hours of non-school related screen time at most, and at least 1 activity of exercise. I believe that was very good advice. I served as our hospital's CME chair and once planned a lecture on pediatric nutrition. The speaker made a suggestion that changed my eating as well as my nutritional advice. She suggested 6 opportunities a day to eat: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, then a snack late morning, mid-afternoon, and at bedtime. 6 opportunities, but only 6, lasting at most 20 or 30 minutes, then taking the food away. The approach should be encouraging yet low-key. Another frequent spiel of mine was that the natural consequence of food refusal is not having someone feed you, it's hunger. The speaker also encouraged one treat per day, but only one. The child could choose it early on, decide when they would eat it, then they enjoy it thoroughly. Portion sizes, of course, would have to be limited in some cases. I mentioned resources in my talk. Writings by Ellen Satter, a pediatric dietitian, can be very helpful, nicely covering both the nutrition and the psychology. She wrote an admittedly 20th century book, How to Get Your Child to Eat, but Not Too Much, that you will still find quite helpful. Let me add that our practice had a registered dietitian come in to meet with families and for consultation. If you have any say in the matter, I encourage that. One last but very important piece of advice on pediatric nutrition is to be an advocate for breastfeeding. Unlike me, you just might have some firsthand experience or eventually will. Our practice had a certified lactation consultant, which I strongly recommend for years, whether or not you breastfed. Let me now transition to another very important and practical problem, sleep. As you are now most likely a pediatric resident, you certainly realize that the importance of sleep. If you happen to be a pediatric resident with children of your own, you know sleep's importance all the more. Let me say, when I first started practice 40 years ago, we didn't learn much of anything about sleep, except, I suppose, enuresis. Pediatric sleep specialists were pretty much unheard of until the mid-1980s, when Dr. Richard Ferber from Boston Children's Hospital began writing about sleep problems. Yet it's certainly over 1/3 of the child's life. I once wrote a handout for our practice called, Why Won't My Child Sleep Through the Night? The answer, of course, is that no one sleeps through the night. We all have times we wake up briefly, look around, realize it's night, put our heads back on the pillow, and hopefully fall back to sleep. Yet parents often need to be taught that their child don't always get that time to go back to sleep part. That's especially true if the parents overattend to them when they awaken. I would suggest that they begin sleep training when their babies reach about 4 months of age. I often say the babies should get a pass during those first 4 months, but after that, they can get a bit smarter. The baby realizes that the parents will come in, hold them, feed them, and cuddle them whenever they awaken and cry. Unfortunately, the babies continue that expectation for as long as they're allowed to, weeks, months, too often years. The parents, of course, say, hey, we need our sleep. They often say, this won't last much longer. I bet she outgrows it next week. Yet the longer it lasts, the more ingrained it becomes. I say that, but I always would address it all by saying, this is so easy for me to talk about calmly in the light of day, yet so difficult for you to handle in the middle of the night. I never believed in making abrupt changes, suddenly letting the baby cry uncontrollably. What I would advise is gradual changes, perhaps letting the baby wait slightly longer. More important, if a baby expected to be fed, to gradually decrease the amount that they fed, gradually nurse a briefer time, or receiving gradually less from a bottle. when the baby needed to be held, to hold them for a briefer and briefer time. You already know we're not just talking about 4-month-olds, but 4-year-olds as well. If they need a parent to lie with them, they then do it, but gradually shorten that time. If they come into the parent's bed and the parents don't want them to, they must allow it for a progressively shorter and shorter time, then put them back into their own bed. Finally, that last point is critically important. Sleep problems are only a problem if one or both parents think that they are. If both parents are truly fine with the sleeping arrangements, let it go. Many cultures have different sleeping traditions, and I might advise. I do recommend you always ask their thoughts on the matter. I always recommend you ask a follow-up question, ensuring both parents truly are comfortable with the current arrangement and will be into the future. Ask about it briefly again at subsequent visits as well. For you know, and I know, that sleep is extremely important. And if you can't solve sleep problems that the parents want solved, you're lucky to practice in an era where pediatric sleep specialists are available. I'll simply share 2 more clinical points. The first, quite briefly, is if it's bacterial, treat it with antibiotics, and if it's viral, don't. Yet I suppose you may have to occasionally tweak that one a bit, like conjunctivitis, for instance. I never did figure that one out very well. I guess with eyes, I always thought I'd err on the side of caution, treating with antibiotic drops. The last one is suggested by my wife, Gail, again. If you're worried about a baby's large head, look at both parents. She has often heard the story about my big head. I had a pediatrician, although 7 decades ago, who was concerned about my head. She was also worried that when she'd give me a shot, I would smile rather than cry. Back then, she, of course, had no CTs or MRIs to make use of. I practiced, and I now live in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. I grew up there as well. I was sent to the University of Chicago to see a Dr. Buchanan, who must have been a pioneer in pediatric neurology. They had to tap my phone. No, it was fine, all normal. They should have looked at my father's head. Then, almost 30 years later, I did an elective in pediatric neurology at the University of Chicago. By then, my mom had told me the whole story. It turns out Dr. Buchanan, although in his 80s, still came to teach there about once a month. Unfortunately, I told the pediatric neurology fellow I was going to introduce myself to Dr. Buchanan. Unfortunately for me, the fellow got to him before I did. As I walked up to him, my hand extended, Dr. Buchanan pointed to me and said, that head, I remember that head. Watch their head size, plot it out each visit, do an ultrasound if you're concerned, and even a scan if need be, but do look at their parents' heads. There are many other more topics I could speak of course. I would hope over 40 years I've learned more than what I've shared so far. But you already know a great deal as well. Every edition of Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care began with the reassuring words to new parents. Trust yourself. You know more than you think you do. And the same goes for you. Final comments. Let me wrap this up by reviewing what I believe to be the most important points. Number 1, treat your patients and their parents as you would want to be treated. Number 2, follow up with your sick patients until they're all better, or at least clearly on the road to recovery. If you can't get them better, then find someone who can. That's what consultants and sometimes emergency departments are for. Yet even then, follow up until they're definitely better. Show them you care and learn from it all. Number 3, every day try to get better at what you do. Clarify something you weren't really sure about earlier in the day. Learn something new and helpful. Make a point of being a better pediatrician today than you were yesterday. 4th, and one thing I should have done but didn't, is to learn a bit of practical technology each day. I intended to get better at using our Epic system each day, but I didn't. I'm now trying to learn at least a little technology each day in retirement, but not very successfully. Yet I encourage you to, not in your 20s or 30s or even 40s perhaps, but in your 50s, 60s, and 70s, because technology won't stand still. In the meantime, please be patient with your older colleagues, even mentor them if they're receptive to it. 5, of immense importance, enjoy your career. I personally can't imagine a more pleasant line of work than you and I have chosen. Communicate that joy to your office staff, too, so that they realize how important and how fun this work we do really is. Finally, and communicate that joy and the importance of your work to your family. Unfortunately, they often have to make significant sacrifices. Your absence when you're working, interruptions when you're on call. Share the fun with them as well. The amusing stories and the satisfying results. Who knows? They may even choose to follow you into a career of pediatrics.